Hi, I'm Larissa from Beekeeping Made Simple, and this video is all about feeding your bees. When to start feeding your bees, when to stop feeding your bees, how to feed your bees. I will share with you my recipes, and I will explain how this varies from the spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now, of course, bees feed themselves. They're famous for it. But there are times of year when the bees can really benefit from the beekeeper giving them an extra boost by feeding them. First, let's talk about the springtime. What I mean by springtime is your time of growth. It is a time that is after your beehive being very small. There is still brood present. It is warm enough out that the bees are coming and going to and from the hive. For most people, this is the actual springtime after a cold winter. But for people in warm climates, this is the time when flowers are starting to bloom after a time when there wasn't a lot of flowers blooming. So for us here in Hawaii, this is January. For people in Pennsylvania, it's probably going to be April. So when do you start feeding your bees this springtime feed? You start when it is warm enough out that the bees are coming and going from the hive in the daytime. It is okay if there are days here and there where it's too cold or rainy for the bees to come and go, but for the most part, it's warm enough out that they are coming and going throughout the day, not just, a cleansing flight here and there. The reason why you feed in the springtime is to prevent your bees from starving and also to encourage growth. What I mean by growth is that you want to encourage the queen to be laying more eggs, and you want to encourage the bees to be building honeycomb. Now, the reason why they wouldn't be just already doing this on their own is because bees are very cautious. And so they are going to slowly grow and build as they see more flowers blooming. The queen isn't going to start laying lots of eggs and having lots of babies in the hive if there's not enough food for them. And the bees need to consume a lot of honey in order to secrete beeswax, and that is what's used to build honeycomb. And they're not going to use up this precious honey at a time of year when there might not be enough food for them, and they could potentially starve. So their number one goal is to not die. Number two, then their goal at this time of year is to grow. So as the beekeeper, you know that you can prevent them from starving and can continue to give them food, but the honeybees aren't aware of this situation. So what we do as a beekeeper is we simulate a nectar flow by producing a 1-to-1 syrup of sugar to water. And so it is important that your syrup follow this recipe and not have too much sugar in it. Or it's also important that you not give them honey to simulate a nectar flow, because that won't work either. You need to give them a syrup so that you're simulating nectar, because nectar is very watery. So this is my recipe for a 1-to-1 ratio of syrup to feed your bees in the springtime. It is 1 part sugar to 1 part water. You're doing this by volume, not by weight, because water weighs more than sugar, and you want to use white sugar. You don't want to use brown sugar or powdered sugar. Powdered sugar has cornstarch added to it. Whether you're using beet sugar or cane sugar, I don't believe that matters. Like, you want it to be this white bleached sugar so that there's not these extra proteins or vitamins in there that could potentially harm the bees. What you're going to want is plain white sugar, water, and then you're going to want supplements. I've always gone with Honeybee Healthy plus the amino booster that they also sell. What that is the Honeybee Healthy is essentially lemongrass oil plus spearmint oil, and those essential oils help the bees digest the syrup so that they don't get eczema and other digestive issues. The amino booster is a liquid protein that can help the bees' longevity as well as with brood production, because with adding bees all this syrup without giving them the extra pollen, it can actually stress out the hive and cause more harm than good. Some people like to add a dry pollen powder to this, like Ultra Bee pollen, which can be found at Man Lake and Dadant. I think even you can buy it off of Amazon. And then this skips having to purchase pollen patties, or you can make pollen patties from this dry powder. It is up to you whether you want to use the pollen patties separate or add the dry pollen to the syrup. I've never added it to the syrup, but it is a way that some beekeepers choose to do things. And it's really important if you live in an area that has small hive beetles, especially in the springtime. For most places with a cold climate, you're probably not really seeing small hive beetles come early spring. But if you are seeing small hive beetles, or you live in an area where it is warm year round, I would go with the dry pollen mixed into your syrup, or just put the tiniest little bit of pollen patty into your hive, not the entire piece. And look in on it 4 days later, 7 days later, just, peek under the lid and see what's going on, because I've seen quite a few times, actually every single time I put a pollen patty into a hive here in Hawaii, the small hive beetles, I guess they lay their eggs, either that or once the larvae hatch, they find it really fast. The bees just do not seem to guard pollen patties whatsoever, and it gets slimy really fast. It only takes a few days for that egg to hatch, and those larvae, their feces is just a really disgusting slime. It's not the end of the world if it happens. You can easily just scrape it out, and usually the rest of the hive is okay, but you really don't want to be giving small hive beetle larvae places to feed. So first, what you're going to do is measure out your water. It really doesn't have to be exact. You just want to make sure that it's either equal parts water to sugar or a little bit more water than sugar. You don't want it to be more than 50% sugar. What I like to do is just take a big container that I have 2 of, and first you're going to pour the water in your pot. You can also just use really hot tap water, but I prefer to boil the water, and that is because the sugar dissolves a whole lot faster. And if you're making a small amount, because you only have 1 beehive, it's not a big deal. But if you're making a bigger quantity, pouring in all that sugar, stirring it gets a little annoying and can take a while if the water isn't hot enough. So what you're going to do is just pour that water in, let it come to a boil or really hot. Then you will turn off the heat, and then you're going to add in your sugar. And stir it up. Just keep stirring until the sugar is fully dissolved, and then just let it cool for a little bit. Once it's cool, then you can add in your supplements, and you can either add that dry pollen to your syrup, or you can also buy or make pollen patties. They sell pollen patties at dateant.com, is the beekeeping supply place that I usually go to, and they really only have one brand option, but I have the links to these supplements in the video description. Put that in a jar and keep it in your refrigerator. If you don't add supplements to it, what some people will do is add apple cider vinegar or a little bit of bleach, and that is because your syrup will go bad really fast within the beehive otherwise. The bleach and the vinegar are more often associated with commercial beekeeping, where they don't want to add the lemongrass essential oil to their hives. So as a hobby beekeeper, I would go with the essential oils, with the Honeybee Healthy or the Pro Health or one of those options. Okay, a big question is, when do you stop feeding your bees? There is no set wrong or right time to stop feeding your bees, and that especially your first couple of years, your goal should be to keep your bees alive. Not to be the world's perfect beekeeper, to have these amazing honeybees that are bringing in 50 pounds of honey, but to just keep them alive for 1 entire year, so that you don't have to buy more bees come springtime. And so the general rule of thumb that I go by is, once that deep box, that first box of your beehive is full, that's when the syrup can come off in the springtime. You can also, if you just have a lot of flowers in your area or spend time sitting by your hives and watch activity, you should see bees coming and going. You should see activity increasing. You should see bees with pollen attached to their legs. And you should see honeycomb being built within the hive. When you see this is when the feed can come off. And of course, if you're not noticing that the bees are taking to the feed, if a full jar has just been sitting in there for weeks, that is another sign that you can take the feed off. You can keep the feed on a little bit longer if you are not sure that there's a lot blooming, or you think there was a small amount of flowers blooming and then it stopped, or the hive is still just pretty slow to grow. You can keep it on there, but definitely by the time the second box on your beehive is halfway full, take the feed off. And that is because you do not want the syrup being mixed in with your honey. Bees can't turn syrup into honey. They will put it in cells and they will store it within the hive, but it's not going to turn into honey. It is going to remain just like this, nectar syrup within the frames. But when you go to spin these frames in an extractor or squish it with the crush and strain method, it's going to get mixed into your honey, and this syrup does not taste good. It is not something you want mixed in with your honey. And of course, if you have a horizontal hive, then it's the same rule of thumb. One box is 10 frames, 8 to 10 frames. So once you have 8 to 10 frames of brood drawn out in your horizontal hive, take the feed out. And once you start to see the bees filling up frame after frame of honey and not as much frames for brood being drawn out, then you definitely want to take that syrup feed out. So there are some downsides to feeding your bees. One is if you are looking to have your honey as certified organic, which the USDA does not certify, but there are other organizations that can certify your honey, you are not allowed to feed your bees whatsoever. Second, there are some studies where people have theorized that feeding your bees can shorten the lifespan of your bees. And although it's good to give your bees an extra boost for a few weeks and to prevent them from starving, it's not something you want to do throughout the year, because you want just your beehive population to be incredibly high. And as I already mentioned, it can make your honey taste bad. One tip I have for you is that while you're making this syrup, I wouldn't put all of it into your beehive. It's good to have an extra little bit saved up and to have a spray bottle handy. My first couple years, actually, when I had top bar beehives, those first couple years of beekeeping, I didn't have a smoker. What I did was I put this liquid syrup into a spray bottle, and I would just spray the area, the bars, before I would put them back together, or when I would first open the hive if the bees seemed agitated. And the bees weren't very aggressive, and that worked okay. I still recommend having a smoker, but it is another method to keeping your bees calm. And other uses for a spray bottle full of syrup is when you are installing a package of bees. It can be good to spray the package before you put the bees into the hive. Kind of just like distracts them before you're doing something that could annoy them. It also is a great way if you are having trouble getting your bees to accept a new queen. I had this only happen once to me in the last 12 years, but I had one hive that they just wouldn't accept this queen. She had been in there for over 10 days. And every time I took the cage out, they were just like biting at it and super aggressive. So I just took that spray bottle of syrup and I sprayed down, I just like sprayed every single frame, both sides that were in the hive, released the queen, and they were just fine with her after that. If you are having trouble getting your bees to build out comb on your foundation, or if you have a flow hive and you're finding that the bees aren't taking to those frames, in addition to making sure that your foundation is waxed, you can take this syrup and spray it on the frames. But it's really important that you have that Pro Health or Honeybee Healthy in there, because it's those essential oils that is attracting the bees. It's not just that sugar syrup that they're after. Oh, also, if you are going to combine bees, like say you have a weak hive that you want to put on top of another hive, or you have a frame of bees that you want to put inside another hive, it's always good to spray down the bees that you're adding. It really just helps just change the smell inside the hive, mask the other queen's pheromones so that there's less fighting among the bees as those other pheromones dissipate. Before I show you how to feed your bees, a quick word about feeders. There's a few different options for you out there. You can buy feeders, you can make your own feeders. I recommend buying a feeder because there is a lot of potential for your feeder to leak onto your bees. I like the feeder in the video description below because it has a wooden rack for bees to land on so they don't drown when accessing liquid syrup. But you can also take that part out and you can put dry white sugar or candy in there for winter time. The two kinds of feeders I don't recommend are one is the kind that you put at the entrance, and that's because it makes it a lot easier for bees to rob them when the feed is right there at the front entrance, as well as bees can smell it a lot more than if it was inside the hive. That's because you're adding these essential oils to the feed, and the bees smell this more so than they're smelling the syrup. The other feeders I'm not a fan of are the kind that are the size and shape of a frame that you hang inside the hive. Some are a little bit better and have a screen over it so bees can't drown in it, but some are really just like a big open space, and you have to put sticks and other things in there for the bees to access the syrup. And I've seen a lot of bees drown in this, even with lots of sticks and rocks and everything in there. You can make your own feeder. You can just poke holes in the lid of a jar and then you hang it upside down in the hive. The thing is that if your holes are too big, then the syrup is going to drip onto the bees, and that is really bad to have that cluster getting wet if its temperatures are still going down sometimes at nighttime. You also then are going to have syrup pooling up on the bottom board in your hive, and even though it's a small pool of syrup, bees can still die and drown in that syrup. And this is how you put a feed inside your hive. You're going to take the lid off, and if you have an inner cover, you're going to take that off as well. And so then you have the uppermost box of your hive. No matter how many boxes it is, it's a good chance that it's just one box, but it can be more. And then you can put the feeder on top of this. If you are using something that looks more like this, you can just put your feeder sitting right on top of the bars and put your pollen patty right next to it. You can alternatively, if you are concerned that bees are going to be building comb up here, you can put your feeder right over here so that bees can access the syrup from the holes and they're not going to be in this upper section, and put the pollen patty next to it. Just want to make sure that there's enough space for the bees to get up here to access the pollen as well. It's really up to you whether you want to have this inner cover or not. And then you need to protect the feeder to make sure it doesn't fall over. So we are going to take an empty box. This can be any size box you like, deep, shallow, medium, does not matter. Doesn't even have to be a beekeeping box, to be honest, if you don't have one. Just has to be a box that's tall enough to fit the feeder, and then you're going to put the lid on top of that. When you are doing it right and the bees are accessing the feed and building new comb, not only are you going to see comb being built in your frames within the beehive, but you should also see underneath your lid little pieces of wax, of beeswax, that are pretty pale yellow or almost looking white. And that is a sign that the bees are secreting wax and building comb. This is a photo of bees festooning, and that's what we call when bees are building beeswax. They eat a lot of honey and then they secrete it out of a gland in their underbelly. This is only the worker bees, and only worker bees at a certain stage of their life are able to produce beeswax. And they form a chain with their bodies and produce the honeycomb. And that chain, the festooning, is essentially a scaffolding for them as they build the cells. Now on to summer feeding. Summer feeding is feeding your bees once they have increased in population and it's warm out, there are flowers blooming. Usually the beekeeper doesn't have to feed their bees in summertime, and as a beginner beekeeper, it's okay if you don't. But as you start keeping bees and go through the years, you might see that you could benefit your bees a little bit more by feeding them in the summertime. The only time you should have to feed your bees in the summer is when the nectar bloom slows down quite a bit, or maybe even stops. Now, I'm not talking about a serious dearth, which is when there's like nothing blooming, but a time of year when there's just like not much, and the hive maybe is starting to go down in population. And so the beekeeper can feed the bees that same 1-to-1 syrup we made in the springtime to help keep the population a decent size, because they know that there's going to be more flowers blooming soon. That might be the fall flowers blooming in the goldenrod. And so you want that population to stay strong so that they have enough bees to go gather that honey. Thing is that bees aren't going to continue to stay the high population and the size that they were, if that means then just like consuming their honey stores for winter. And so if you feed the bees this nectar, you're stopping them so that they don't have to eat this winter storage and keeping that population high. The downside to doing this is that you don't want this mixed in with your honey. So if you have already harvested your honey, you don't have to worry about this. But if you have honey for harvesting, put some kind of mark on those frames so you know that those frames are fully capped and ready for harvest and do not have any nectar syrup, don't have any sugar syrup mixed in with it. A word about feeding your bees when there is a dearth. A dearth is when there is a very low amount of nectar for the bees to gather, which, you know, otherwise it's just not a lot of nectar producing flowers are blooming. And this is common to happen in the late summer, early fall, and you will see your bees are going to be more aggressive. You might see bees stinging each other, bees trying to rob each other. And so it is really important to not feed your bees that same syrup you made in the springtime, because what you're doing is encouraging robbing to your beehive, because that honey be healthy and the amino boosters, the bees smell that really quickly and they're just really drawn to it, even if you put it into a feeder in the upper section of your hive. So this is what some beekeepers will do during a dearth. They will either provide a lot of feed a good distance from their beehives. Now they're going to be feeding all the pollinators, not just theirs, but they put it a good distance so it's not attracting attention to their beehives, and it's just giving all of the bees a little bit of a food so that they don't rob each other. This is one option. It can really stress out your bees. Bees, they don't look healthy when they are robbing. It's really interesting. They start to look really oily and black and not fuzzy and healthy the way that they normally do. So if you are seeing your bees looking really stressed out and just a lot of aggressiveness from your hives, I would take away that outside feeder, because it sounds like it's doing more harm than good. You can feed your bees. So the alternatives are that you can feed your bees inside the hive at the upper part, but just don't add those amino acids and the honey be healthy. You want to put in a little bit of apple cider vinegar. So 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar for every gallon of syrup. And that just prevents the syrup from going bad when it's in the hive. Or you can make that same syrup you had from springtime with the honeybee healthy and the amino acids, so that they're healthy and they're not getting digestive problems eating the syrup, and you can put it on the hive only at nighttime. So this should be a really quick thing. I recommend using your inner cover so that you're not affecting the bees much at all. And then you would have your empty box, and you would be able to just throw your feeder in, just like pick up the lid, throw the feeder in, put the lid back down. Shouldn't even take a full minute. Or if your feeder is a box, then, you know, just take the lid off, throw that box feeder on, and put the lid back on. You don't want to be using a feeder that's one of those frame feeders where you're going to be bothering the bees and annoying them. So that is how you can help your bees during a time when there's not a lot of food coming in without causing a huge amount of trouble for your bees. Okay, now on to the late summer fall feedings. This is done to give your bees food so that they don't eat into their winter storage. This can also be a way to boost your population one final time so that the bees, they have a good population going into winter time. The more bees you have, the bigger that cluster to produce warmth and keep that hive strong and going and alive through those cold winter months. So keep in mind that the queen lays the eggs for the winter bees in the late summertime. Now I'm talking about when you have a cold winter where it's going well below 65 degrees out in the daytime and the bees are clustered up in the hive for weeks or months. And so when that happens in the late summer, well before it gets cold out, the queen starts to lay eggs for the winter bees. These winter bees have different fat deposits. They are different from the rest of the bees in the hive that you see the rest of the time of the year. And that is because these bees are taking the hive through the winter, and they last months, as opposed to the worker bees in the hive in the springtime are only lasting 6 to 8 weeks. And here in Hawaii, they actually say that the worker bee's lifespan is closer to 4 to 6 weeks. And so making sure that your hive is healthy in the late summertime is crucial so that these winter bees are as healthy as possible and have a high population to get the hive through. So that's making sure the varroa mite levels are low this time of year and making sure that they have a good population. So it's also good to feed them sugar syrup this time. I would still add the amino boost and the honeybee healthy. Pollen patties should not be necessary this time of year. There should be adequate pollen already in the hive, but you can add a little bit and just tiny bit to make sure that small hive beetles don't start to get to it, or add it to the syrup this time of year. And this is to just help boost the queen, especially if there's not a lot of nectar coming in, so that she is laying more than she otherwise would. So what exactly is this time for you? Well, if you're harvesting honey, you don't have to harvest honey, especially if there's not a lot in the hive or it's your first or second year, maybe you don't have that. But if you are harvesting honey, you do this after you harvest the honey. And how do you know when you harvest honey? Well, you should be filling out an inspection sheet. I have a link to a free one you can download from my blog. You fill it out every week when you inspect your hive, or however often you inspect your hive. And you write down how many frames of honey you see. Over the course of the weeks, you're going to see the amount of honey in the hive increase, and then you're going to see it stop, or you're going to see it decrease. When that happens, that means it's probably the time to harvest honey, especially if you know that there's not going to be a big bloom coming on, or if it's late summer, because any of those fall harvests for most climates aren't going to be the honey that you're going to be consuming. They're going to be the feed for the bees over the winter time. So once you're done harvesting your honey, you don't know what time that is, join a local bee club, look at their Facebook page, ask a question, and ask them when people are usually harvesting honey. After that is when you can put in a syrup. If your population is super high, this might not be necessary, but if your population is moderate to low, it couldn't hurt the bees to put in a feed for them to make sure that they have food to eat and they are not eating into their winter storage. Okay, so this is the part that people have different theories about. Some people feed their bees the same thing they give them in the springtime, a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to water, with the honeybee healthy and the amino boost, and they give them pollen because they want to encourage growth. That is the recipe for encouraging growth and getting your queen to lay and encouraging brood production. Of course, in the springtime, no one will question this. That's what you want. That is what the bees always want, is growth and brood production. But come the fall, some beekeepers say you want twice as much sugar, 2-to-1 ratio of 2 parts sugar, 1 part water, because that makes it easier for the bees to evaporate the moisture and to just have some more food in the hive so that they are not eating into their winter storage. And so the more food in the hive, the better come winter time. Other people say, I do not want to just give them food. I want my bee population to be as high as possible. The more winter bees, the better for my beehive. What is best? Who is to say? Personally, I say go for brood production. The more winter bees, the better. And if that means it's a little bit more work for them to evaporate that moisture, so be it. However, I just want you to be aware that this is 2 different ways to go about it. Because if one way doesn't work for you, this is an alternative that you should try. Or if you have multiple beehives, try one and the other and see what happens to your bees in the fall. Give one hive a 2-to-1 sugar syrup and give another hive 1-to-1 sugar syrup with all the amino acids and pollen in there and see what the bees do. After all, try not to take beekeeping so seriously. We don't want the bees to die. We don't want to harm the bees, but every climate is different and you're going to see different things everywhere you go. So it's best to not make assumptions about what is best or to just take everyone's word as gospel and to give it a go for yourself and see what works best for you and your climate and your bees. Once the queen has stopped laying, that is when you definitely want to get rid of any syrup that has pollen in it or that amino boost and all pollen patties. You do not want to encourage brood production or the queen to start laying once it is time for her to stop. And that is otherwise known as winter. So you're going to start to see that the temperatures are going down. It's getting cooler out in the evenings. It is below 65 degrees Fahrenheit in the evenings, but still warm enough out in the daytime for you to open a hive. You have already harvested your honey and probably the fall blooms are coming to an end or have already ended. You are going to see your queen not laying so much or she has stopped. Make sure that the syrup is out of your hive at this point and you are not feeding your bees any kind of pollen or amino boosters anymore. Once you are ready to close up your hive for the winter, that is when you are going to feed them differently. You want to make sure there's no more syrup in the hive. Once it is too cold out for the bees to come and go, you do not want, some say that the liquid syrup is bad for the hive because it encourages more condensation within the hive. There's already a ton of condensation, so I don't know if that's actually a feasible problem. However, if the bees cannot come and go on from the hive whenever they want to do a cleansing flight, it's not really good for them to have that syrup within the hive. You want to provide them with either candy or dry white sugar. Alrighty, so now that it is getting colder out and you're ready to close your hive up for winter, you have adequate honey for the bees, you're going to want to give them extra feed. And this is to prevent them from starving to death. All syrup needs to be taken off the hive once you are preparing your hive for winter. And you're going to add white sugar. This can literally be just taking the dry white sugar and pouring it onto the inner cover. Not only is this very easy to do and to replace as needed, but if condensation does drip down off of the lid. Now under your lid, when you're preparing your hive for winter, you should have some kind of piece of insulation under here, and that will help prevent some condensation forming up under your lid because you know what happens is the bees are producing heat in here with their cluster, and then the outside temperature is cold, and so when the heat and the cold meet, that's when the condensation happens. So it's going to happen on the sides, on the walls of the beehive, and that is fine because there needs to be moisture in the hive. The bees need this water. However, you just don't want a whole bunch pooling up under the lid and then dripping down onto the cluster and getting them wet because it's hard enough to stay warm as it is when it is cold out, but a lot harder when you're also wet and cold. And so having that insulation under the lid helps prevent a lot of that condensation from happening and more so happening on the sides. But having this dry white sugar means that when condensation does drip down, it's dripping onto this, which will absorb a lot of your sugar. So instead of having a quilt box or something of that sort that is going to be absorbing this moisture and it's just going to be lost, and having a whole bunch of wet fabric that's going to go moldy in your hive, it's going to be absorbed by this, and when the bees come up to eat the sugar, they're also getting that water, and that condensation, that water is not being lost, and can potentially also help them eat the sugar a little bit more easily because it's also wet. An alternative is to make a candy, or you can buy a candy. They sell them on beekeeping supply sites, and it's just a hard candy that you make. So to make a candy, all you have to do is you take a pot and you're going to put 5 pounds of dry white sugar into the pot. Then you are going to take 1 cup of water and add 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to that water. And then you are going to slowly pour that cup of water with the vinegar to your dry white sugar and just keep stirring and stirring and stirring. And once you're done stirring that up and it's pretty mixed up, then what you're going to do is you're going to take your candy board. Candy board pretty much looks very similar to this inner cover, but it's going to have a little bit more depth to it, and you are going to take a little bit of a pollen patty, whether bought or made, and you want to put it in there a little bit, put it in there somewhere off to the side. You want to take a little wooden block and put that over an area that the bees are going to be entering to get up into the candy, so that your candy isn't taking up the entire space. And then you're going to fill the rest of your feeder with the candy and push it down so that it's packed down. And it will dry out and it will turn into a hard candy. And make sure you have your insulation moisture board inside your cover. Put this on top. There are going to be times when you aren't going to be able to check on your candy to see if there's any left and if you need to add more, but there should be times when you can. You're not going to be taking apart the hive or anything. You're just going to be peeking under here and checking on your bees. But there should also be lots of honey in your hive. So when you're closing your hive up, you should really just go to the lower box and give your hive a little bit of a nudge. See how much it weighs, and keep doing that over the course of the next few weeks and months, and see how the weight of the hive decreases. Once you're noticing the weight of the hive decreasing quite a bit, that's when you're going to want to peek under and see if you need to give your bees more food. Ants are going to love this.